What's going on, my fellow patriots and Trump supporters? This video I'm creating is designed to highlight not only the political ignorance that has been fueling left-wing identity movement mongers, but also to underline the historical illiteracy associated with most of their claims, and how disturbingly uninformed these people on the left really are. First and foremost, let's address the topic at hand. On August 13, 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, a peaceful rally was planned to protest the city's plan to remove the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Simultaneously, as with any rally planned by the right, a counter-protest was organized by extreme left-wing agitators calling for his removal with shouts, screams, and physical attacks against those protesting his removal, while the mainstream media once again continued to justify their assaults on the right by claiming that white hate groups were protecting a symbol of white supremacy and oppression. A narrative, by the way, that has been popularized not by Black Lives Matter, who are only puppets of George Soros, or any other race-baiting left-wing minority organizations, but instead by white left-wing socialist Democrats and neo-anti-progressive liberals. Now, in order to show just how historically illiterate the left is and how ethically negligent the left-leaning mainstream news media is, I'm going to share a brief history on Robert E. Lee and how the narrative being pushed by the left to silence the right is nothing more than propaganda and lies created to inflame racial tension between blacks and whites here in America, funded by George Soros, and sustain ideological and racial polarization. Let me begin by explaining that the Civil War consisted of two sides: the blue, which represented the Union, and the gray, which represented Confederates. After the war was won by the Union, a second war was silently executed in the form of information warfare, where through the practice of historical revisionism, the North rewrote the details entailing the Civil War and what the war was, according to them, about. They then used history to demonize the Confederates as the exclusive oppressors of the black race. Thereafter, through academic and oral traditions, these stories, as written by the North, were reinterpreted by scholars to reflect a favorable view of the North by accomplishing three things. One, rewriting the motivations and purpose of the Civil War. For instance, today the public school system teaches that the Civil War was started in order to free the slaves, which is not true. In all actuality, the Civil War, as stated in many historical books, was started because the South wanted to secede from the North. And if the South would have seceded from the North would have basically lost money and gone bankrupt as a government. Because although the North's economy was strong, it was still based on manufacturing, clothing, and textiles, which was dependent on the cotton being produced by the South, which gave the South an economical advantage over the North, if we base it on the fact that agriculture is one of the pillars of a self-reliant nation. Another fact to this distorted form of history is that the North didn't believe slavery was morally wrong, but instead, because many white immigrants were losing jobs to the slave market, it became morally acceptable, politically correct, to proclaim they were contesting slavery and a Republican-controlled government instead of promoting the pro-white agenda of less jobs being available for European immigrants. The second form of information warfare was the promoted belief that slavery was, as a collective, condemned by the North and morally acceptable by the South. Yet history teaches us that even though Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican, favored freeing the slaves, his Democratic Vice President, Andrew Jackson, did not. And although Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, his wish was not for them to remain in America, but instead to ship them back to Africa after the war was won in order to make more jobs available for European immigrants seeking work in America. But due to the extensive costs associated with his plan, funding was minimal and most of the slaves remained free men in America. As a reference to this being a fact, research the American Colonization Society, which was started in 1817 and used the term unkidnapping Africans as a pretext to send free slaves back to the African continent, which, by the way, later on led to the birth of two nations formed by freed American slaves, Moravia and Liberia. By 1862, Congress gave $600,000 for the transportation of Africans willing to return back to Africa or other regions such as Brazil, Colombia, and St. Croix. These are facts. The Confederates didn't do this, the North did this. Conclusively, by 1865, every general and staff in the Union still owned slaves and had slaves serving them, including Union General William T. Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant, even after the 13th Amendment was in place on December of 1865. Ironically and surprising to most people, including the mainstream media, Robert E. Lee never owned or purchased slaves. His slaves were inherited in 1862, which he chose to free, contrary to the narrative being pushed by left-wing nutjobs who have shown how oblivious they are to the facts. And even worse, how disturbingly historically illiterate the vast majority of these identity movement mongers really are. Now, as an outro, let me state that Robert E. Lee was also Superintendent of the United States Military Academy and a military engineer for the United States Army who distinguished himself in the Mexican-American War. So in short, not only did Robert E. Lee not own slaves or purchase, while Union generals did, he freed the slaves he inherited and was a distinguishable member of both the United States Army and the Confederates. This is